Get into the conversation. Hello, everybody who has tuned in today and decided to spend their evening with us, getting some knowledge. My name is Rico Washington. For those of you who may not be familiar with me, I am one of the team leads from Street Riders. And if you're not familiar with Street Riders, I'll let you know a little bit about us. Street Riders NYC is a collective, a movement, and a community born in the streets of New York City that coalesced in protest and connected during the social unrest surrounding the police killings of unarmed Black citizens in the spring of 2020. Street Riders NYC has a collective interest in cycling to protest while providing cycling support and protection to other protest groups across the city, focusing on issues of justice for the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, as well as police reform, racial equality, and community direct action. If you'd like to follow us and keep up with what we're doing, you can do so across all social media platforms at Street Riders NYC, one word. And with that, we'll go ahead and introduce our guests for today, our very esteemed, very learned guests. This conversation is entitled The Black LGBTQ plus Community and the Pathway to Liberation. And with us, we have Durryle Brooks. Durryle Brooks is an interdisciplinary scholar practitioner and a social justice educator from Baltimore, Maryland. He is the founder and CEO of Love and Justice Consulting, LLC, an organization that provides leaders with social justice learning opportunities to increase their capacity to effectively and authentically engage difference. He is currently a research associate at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he's currently researching and examining historical and contemporary implications of medical mistrust and its impact on COVID-19 racial disparities amongst African Americans. Additionally, he works to examine the silent epidemic of intimate partner violence among Black, gay, and bisexual men. Next up, we have Vanessa Warri. Vanessa is a transgender Nigerian American researcher, strategist, and advocate committed to the liberation, empowerment, and safety of Black transgender women and marginalized community existing at various intersections of oppression. From foster care to homelessness on the streets of San Francisco, Vanessa faced challenges that helped educate her about the harsh realities disproportionately affecting queer and trans people of color. These experiences informed the development of her personal mission to heal fractured and forgotten communities by advocating for their needs and conducting research to inform public policies that improve quality of life for disenfranchised communities. For 11 years, she has provided empowerment-based direct services and education for transgender communities and LGBTQIA+ youth. As a research associate for the UCSF Center for Excellence for Transgender Health, she focuses on health-based intervention development designed to facilitate behavior change toward healthcare engagement. Vanessa is also involved in collaboration with Gays and Lesbians Living in Transgender Society Incorporated in New York, supporting with advocacy for SESTA, FOSTA, and developing national rapid responses to anticipate and address the challenges and dangers this legislation will have on transgender women of color. Vanessa hopes to be able to support younger transgender women of color in their educational attainments by creating initiatives that center transgender women in research about them. In January, she became a Point Scholar with the Point Foundation, the nation's largest scholarship granting organization geared towards helping LGBTQIA+ students of merit achieve their full academic and leadership potential. She's currently an MSW PhD candidate in social welfare at UCLA with a focus on social and economic justice and mental health wellness. Woo! Busy, busy, busy. Both of y'all. That's right, that's right. So thank you so much again for both of you agreeing to be a part of this very important discussion. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump right in. So the first question would be, queer Black folks have essentially shaped the arc of various important influential movements in American history that have resonated internationally. And everything from the Harlem Renaissance, the advent of jazz, blues, rock and roll, the civil rights movement, and Black Lives Matter movement, we've been there. So why then does it appear as if the Black queer identity has been obscured from American history? And I'll let whoever wants to jump in first.
Vanessa, you want to go?
Sure, I could start us off. So, to answer this question, I think, what first came up for me is I don't think it appears to be anything. It definitely has been obscured from American history. And I think the answer lies within that question, looking at American history in order to understand the absence of Black queer identity from that story, remembering that America was never really intended to be for us as Black people to access. And we were only brought on to build the foundations for its success. And back then we weren't even seen as people. And that kind of history doesn't just go away with the many different advancements in our collective understanding that we've made. So in order for Black queer identity to have been represented accordingly across these key points in our history, it would mean that Black life would have to have been valued in the first place. And our modern history is really evidence of the current cultural values and the absence of the acknowledgement of the many contributions made by Black queer folks is very telling of who sits at the top and who authors those narratives that we accept as true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, I'm in complete agreement with Vanessa. When I think about sort of my work and particularly thinking about my early studies around the civil rights movement and looking at Dr. King, we know that there was a systemic erasure of key figures, particularly known as, that I didn't learn about until like way late in college, Bayard Rustin, who was a particular architect for, Dr. King and March on Washington. So like, so it was this sort of, we have always played a part. We've always been around helping to support the Black cause, to sort of recognizing that that's sort of been one of the most insidious and destructive sort of the ways in which white supremacy have like just really came together to kind of squash every ounce of our dignity and humanity. And sometimes we've been forced as a community to feel like we have to choose one over the other. I have to choose my Blackness over my queerness. And what we saw in that particular example with Dr. King and sort of Bayard Rustin was in fact that was a political decision made because they were trying to make a calculated a decision around what's going to be the best strategy to sort of shift this culture and get some wins, for Black dignity and Black life. And unfortunately, that came at the expense of not only queer folks, but also cis heterosexual women who had already been alongside leading, when I'm thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer and all these other brilliant women who are always on the front line, and yet because of patriarchy, because of the ways that racism is embedded into patriarchy, began to sort of force people to make these safe or strategic decisions, when in reality they were only just perpetuating oppression of folks who have been here. So it was an intentional erasure. It wasn't a mistake. It was not something that was chance. It was somebody thought it was better to put sort of to hold one identity, particularly our Blackness, as a political strategy and squash everybody else. And I think we're still living with the ramifications of that today. And I'll say that the way that it looks like today, for the fact that I didn't know any Black trans women growing up in Baltimore City, but I knew them, right? And so it was like that we didn't even have a vocabulary to talk about who they were in the world. And it wasn't until I started developing a relationship that I even understood why it was important to recognize Black transness and Black trans women specifically, because they were already leading the change efforts in Baltimore City back in the 80s and the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the crack epidemic. And so for me in my life, that's what happens for a generation of people when you choose one identity over the other.
Good point. I mean, speaking of, Black Lives Matter in specific, it seems like, they've been around more visibly since 2015, 2016. So in that time, it seems to me that the Black queer presence in these Black liberation movements have become more visible, more than they have before in history. We think about the three Black queer women that started Black Lives Matter. And then also Durryle McKesson, who was, a very visible figure during that period. But it seems like, we're still dealing with a lot of those push and pulls, that tug of war, because as you probably know, there was a rift in the movement when some people discovered that Durryle McKesson was actually queer. One person had remarked on Twitter, "I wish Durryle wasn't a homosexual male. He would have had more support from Black men. It's hard for us to take instructions from a gay male." So how have Black queer folks been able to actually reconcile that anti-queer bias that's experienced within the Black Lives Matter movement from people that they're actually putting their bodies on the front lines to protect?
So I can jump if that's okay with you, Vanessa. Yeah. So I think so for me that is a layered. We need a layered analysis, particularly when we think about sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, the fact that the three Black queer women were the founders. And one of the things, if you sort of picked up Alicia Garcia's book, begins to talk about the ways in which even in that space, Durryle McKesson was actually a part of sort of co-opting the experience and sort of and so from our community, and particularly in that very first introduction, I believe in her book, talks about the ways in which sort of certain folks was given credit for building and sort of becoming the face of the Black Lives Matter movement, when in fact they weren't a part of the initial planning or the development, but saw that as an opportunity to kind of sort of do brand recognition, if you will. And so and I just kind of wanted to name that because even within our communities, as I think about the ways in which oppression shows up, in particular internalized oppression and dominance, is that sometimes when we're doing this work, Black, gay, and bisexual men are still antagonistic to Black trans folks across the board. And so when you start talking about that, layered on white supremacy, layered on just cis heterosexual men and sort of cisgender folks across the board, it gets really, really complicated. And so from where I sit is that when, yes, we've always laid our bodies on the line. And yes, there's always been a group of people, I don't care who they are, whether they're my grandmother or just the other Black folk in my life, who always wanted me to be silent. They were always willing to reap the benefits of my gifts and my talents, but always wanted me to do that at the cost of my own identity. And I think, again, when I start not only thinking about the individual level, I think about sort of the system level, and particularly when I'm in the Black church, that has been my experience, that they wanted something from me, but they wanted me silent. And for me, it was at that moment when I knew that one, again, Black folk ain't a monolith, and that folks who are living in our lives and our bodies and our beings all make choices and calculated choices in a way that preserves their own privilege. And so if cis het folks, queer folks, like if you're not willing to really give up your privilege to really kind of be in community with one another, I think we just want to try to be sort of, as Gail Rubin, scholar way back in the day, talks about the charm circle. Everybody's trying to move to the center, but the center is white, cisgender, heterosexual. And so folks are willing to sacrifice things. Even when you think about the marriage equality movement, we were willing to, Black folks and Black and brown folks said, we don't need no marriage equality. It was always a political agenda of white, gay folk who said, this is what we want, because that was going to get us closer to normal in this society and to be valued. So, I think, again, it's layered, and I think we need to have analysis on many, many levels, and not be surprised that folks out here wanting us to sacrifice ourselves for a cause, but then won't give us shit for it, because that's heartache.
All the smoke.
Yes, that was beautifully well said. And I really do appreciate you, naming internalized oppression as well as the need for this multi-layered look at it, because if you take these two things together, they are inextricably linked. You think about generations of Black folks who have been socialized and indoctrinated with these very Eurocentric, white supremacist ideologies, one generation socializing the next, and nothing happens in a silo, right? We're talking about looking at particular socio-historic, socio-cultural, socio-political across time. It sort of helps to understand, I think, this phenomenon of why, Black queer folks find themselves not receiving the support they need from Black folks in general, regardless of the fact that we are laying our bodies at the front line. And I think, in terms of your question, how have we been able to reconcile? I don't know that we have. I think we're still in a process of reconciling. And where we are at, I don't know. I see it as a process. I couldn't really pinpoint where I believe we are, but it is definitely difficult when I, as a Black person and a queer person, trans person, can recognize that, right? And show up for, my people, and show up and push back against the brutality that is happening against Black bodies in this country. And I can understand how, some of my skin folk, as I'll say, because not everybody is skin, right? How some of my skin folk can be behind a little bit in that thought and catching up and seeing our commonalities, right? But then you think about the division that's happening within Black communities, and you think about how that was a strategic implant on the part of white supremacy and racism and all of these to keep us from coalition building with each other, because a lot more binds us than separates us. So it's definitely difficult to say, like, how have we been able to reconcile. I think there's been a great level of empathy and understanding on the part of Black queer folks who are facing this and yet still continue to show up, still continue to put their bodies on the line in the hopes that, our people just see us as their people and we work together. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about what's been happening over the past 9 to 12 months. It seems like amidst this second wave of Black Lives Matter protests, there seemed to be more emphasis on the fatal violence that's been inflicted on Black trans people in the US in specific. Durryle, you're doing some actually interesting research in the way of like intimate partner violence and the disproportionate way that it impacts the Black queer community. How much of that actually factors into the bigger picture of the instigators of this kind of violence, and what resources are actually available to try and mitigate that?
Yeah, so first, thank you. So, my research at Hopkins has really been focused on understanding the unique needs of intimate partner violence survivors who are Black and gay and bisexual. Partly because oftentimes in the research, we lump trans folks in there, and recognizing that they have really unique, that we all have really unique experiences based on those identities. And so I was able to sort of begin to focus in to sort of highlight this area and not to flatten trans people's experiences with intimate partner violence. And so that was the first priority for me in doing this research. But the study that I'm particularly on right now, we had surveyed over 355 young Black and bisexual men in Baltimore, DC, and Philadelphia. Their average age was 20, so they're actually quite young. And about 35% of them had reported experiencing intimate partner violence in the last 3 months. And so, I say that to contextualize it. When I began to dig inside of sort of what was really going on there, physical violence was a part of that, but also emotional violence was a part of that, sexual abuse. Folks are in sort of relationships with folks who are either forcing them to have sex without condoms or sort of pulling them away from their families and communities. And so just to have a much more nuanced understanding of what intimate partner violence was, it wasn't always just the physical ones. But I will say, physical violence is one of the primary ways in which it does show up. And over 28% of those folks experience physical violence that, was like hit, shove, push, and whatnot. And I say that because when I looked at the larger landscape of our research on intimate partner violence across the country, first of all, there are very few places that are actually taking good care and good deep analysis at the needs of LGBT survivors broadly, right? That is just across the board. The mainstream IPV movement has been traditionally focused on cisgender white women as victims and cisgender white men as perpetrators. And they use that analysis to create their programs, their mainstream programs, and then basically erase all of the queer experience, even though intimate partner violence happens in every type of relationship. With that being said, when I think about sort of the role that physical violence plays specifically in this particular moment around the deaths of Black trans women, oftentimes because no one is capturing that data, it's going underreported. And so we know that Black trans women, and particularly some of the most gruesome murders, is because they've been in relationships with men who can't seem to, I'm not sure how to say this, they can't seem to manage their own desires and their own feelings, and sort of layering in their fragile masculinity and the socialization that Black men, or in this context, but men all, whatever, somehow have the right to be able to do what they want to people's bodies, sort of has resulted in many, many Black trans women's murders in this country, and it's underreported. And that's why we need, a better definition of intimate partner violence. It doesn't say you just have to be with them right now, but we understand intimate partner violence as ever being in a relationship, past or present, because usually something might have happened, and just because you're not together at that moment does not mean that someone in your past might not come back and sort of seek violence against you. And so there are so many lives that have been lost, Black trans lives, because of intimate partner violence, and because nationally we failed to care about their experiences, our experiences. Those numbers that we see are probably underreported, and we need to get a better structure in place to do that work.
Vanessa, you were actually quoted on CNN as saying that Black trans women typically don't live past the age of 35. It's a very disturbing statistic. You think there's any tie-in with what Durryle was just talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Intimate partner violence is most definitely a factor in looking at the violence and the fatalities that are inflicted against Black trans women. I see this, and I'm sure my colleague would agree with me. This stems from institutional violence that has informed this toxic culture, criminalizing and finding ways of othering the experience of Black queerness via cis heteronormativity and racism and white supremacy, and really as being responsible for creating the conditions that make these types of violence prevalent in our society. And through the intersectional experiences of being both Black and trans, we see these disproportionate rates of violence occurring. To your previous point about what is the resource, I definitely think that the resource is education. We are not only talking about the need for education to help the existing members of our society, we're talking like unpack and unlearn the centuries of oppressive ways of thinking and doing, but we're also talking about creating the tools for the future members of our society. If we're talking about a strategic push towards creating that social impact, education is really going to be key in first helping them to unpack, like putting a full stop to the way that we've been socialized and conditioned to think and view Blackness and transness in this country, but also, how do we then flip and create for the future the society that we are currently actively trying to fight for today.
Yeah, and so if I can add, Rico, to that. So I appreciate you, Vanessa, because I clearly forgot to respond to that part. Around resources. And what's been interesting in my study is that mainstream IPV serving organizations fail Black trans women, Black queer people across the board. And when I look to find resources, one of the things that I've been traveling a bunch to sort of different networks around traditional IPV spaces. And what I have to talk to them about is that education piece, but talking about sort of specifically, y'all have to address racism and heteronormativity in your service provision. And because it's not what you would hate to happen and what has happened consistently, for example, in Baltimore, our providers, they were only, so the feds just authorized the Violence Against Women Act to sort of include LGBT folks and gender identity, I think it was in 2015. So it was only in the last like 5 years that there was actual a mandate to say, if you don't improve your programs, to be inclusive, you're not going to get any federal money. And so folks are only just recently doing their LGBT 101s, but now they think they're going to be able to serve folks, when in reality, one session ain't going to change you. Because your design was already based on a white supremacist ideology, a cis ideology, so that even the interventions that you use at your local institution will perpetuate harm and violence against our community. And so it is actually underfunded, under-resourced, and what I would love to see are Black queer folks, BIPOC folks coming together to create their own IPV entities to serve and meet our own needs. Because right now, mainstream providers are, I think, failing in really significant and sometimes even deadly ways.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. I just wanted to take a moment before I ask the next question to let everyone who is in attendance know that you will be able to pose questions to the panel. At any point, you can feel free to raise your hand, and we will let you at the end of our discussion ask directly questions to the panel. If you're a little shy and you would prefer me to ask instead, I'll do that for you. You can just drop your question into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll go ahead and read your question to the panelists. And with that being said, we'll go ahead and continue with our discussion. The next thing I wanted to bring up was last May in Tallahassee, a trans man named Tony McDade was murdered by an officer of the Tallahassee Police Department. Just before the murder, the officer was actually said to have, by witnesses, hurled a racial slur at Tony. We can all imagine what that is. The murder actually happened 2 days before George Floyd in Minneapolis, and there was obviously like a contrast in the media attention that one received versus the other. Can we attribute that just to circumstance flatly, or does gender and gender presentation factor into that?
If you don't mind, Durryle. Not at all. I think that gender absolutely factors into this. And I think that with the example of Tony, it highlights the intentional erasure that Black and trans identity from the national narrative that we have going on about police brutality in America. You know, mainstream media, if they do their part in addressing the murders of Black trans people, they only tend to focus on Black trans women, and it really emphasizes the erasure of Black trans men in this country. If anything, the murder of Tony McDade at the hands of police should have been used as more evidence of the epidemic of police brutality against Black men and Black people, regardless of gender. But with Tony, we definitely saw the spirit of separateness and of being similar but not same. We saw the media address Tony's mental health, which for me also quietly signaled to larger, more problematic rhetoric about gender dysphoria, and the medicalization of the trans experience in general. So Tony's transness was definitely used to remove his story and his murder from the larger Black Lives Matter movement in response to state-sanctioned violence.
Okay. So the next question would be about, there were two names, obviously, that we were hearing during the protests over the past 9 to 12 months that were trans. One was Tony McDade, and the other was Nina Pop, who was a Missouri trans woman. And those two stories definitely brought to light the epidemic of Black trans folks being murdered in this country. But since the protests and the public outcry over the past 12 months, has there actually been any action from local, state, or federal people as far as a task force or legislation is concerned? Specific to Black trans folks?
No. No. That's a really quick and short answer. No. And, I think that anything that we do see that is, at the, legislative level, at the local or state level, it's really, talk can be really performative. And you know, we definitely have to name that. Like, there is a marked difference between talking about doing something and introducing bills and legislation and actually creating change with intention. And so I can't say that I see that.
Hmm. Well, since we're already on that train and going down that track, let's talk about what happened last week. Seems like there was a glimmer of hope. Everybody got all excited and celebrating. I guess you could call it a small victory in the House of Representatives when they passed the Equality Act. For those of you out there who are not too familiar with that, it's a bill that would ban discrimination against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. This would actually protect individuals and institutions, including but not limited to the military, public and private education, and corporate America. But like, what are the odds that this will actually pass in the Senate? We already know that we've had our problems with the Senate in the past under the previous the previous administration. And it seems like there's still a little bit of hemming and hawing going on there in the Senate as we speak. And it's been majority Republican and largely conservative until very recently. But if it's passed into law, is it going to be enough?
Well, you know, I think from my perspective, like, so deeply appreciative of, you know, the House doing what they were doing, right? And it matters. We understand policy level shifts do create a better context for us to get sort of down to the material level of change. Clearly, the civil rights movement didn't sort of guarantee us sort of the free types of liberties that we would have hoped for. We still see discrimination showing up in every aspect and every institution in this country. And yet we know that it was able to sort of create some pathways of accountability. Now, similar, I would think this would probably play out because essentially, if we thought about sort of the Senate, what is very clear to me is that there are Democrats who are basically Republicans and conservative and are willing to engage in practices that continue to dehumanize Black folks, queer folks, folks who are different. So we might be able to eke out a victory depending on sort of like all of that. But I'm also, what I know is that we have to deal with this really ugly reality is that there are people who literally thrive and make profit off hate and marginalization. And they are in our Senate and our reps, this is their brand. It is their brand to target Black women and giving them abortion access when we know that's going to like, there's, so in some ways, I deeply question the capacity to really see a significant change because our leadership is still predominantly white and male. And so I'll take a passage of a policy, but our structure actually needs to be radically transformed.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'll just add to that by completely agreeing. Like, it is definitely needed as part of our strategy in this ongoing fight for our liberation. Personally, it's hard for me to fully buy in, you know, because trans Black folks were still being disproportionately murdered and experiencing intersecting oppression and violence under the Obama administration. You know, prior to, you know, any equal rights protections being removed by this previous administration. So, you know, things are moving in the right direction, but as Durryle said, it's not enough. And to go even further, like, you know, we definitely need to speak on the presence of racism and white supremacy embedded within the institution that's the US government. We know where the conservatives stand. It's no big shock. But also, like, the presence of neoliberalism would have us believe that they're the key to our liberation, while also simultaneously being responsible for perpetuating the same harm rooted in the oppression of Black, Brown, Indigenous, immigrant, Muslim, queer, Asian folks. So we definitely need our allies more to move and use their power and their privilege moving through these spaces to really help problematize these very like large, very uncomfortable, seemingly permanent fixtures of our society because all systems should really be open to evaluation and revision, right? Like in academic world, when we look at evaluation research, we always say everything can be adapted, everything can be evaluated. And I think that this is no different. The difference is that we really need and should be welcoming the opportunity to finally bring community to the table about these active conversations that are currently happening about their lives. And to defer to them as being the experts they are when it comes to addressing their needs, and really uplifting that knowledge that's embedded in the lived experience of queer Black people in the US. In research world, we have this idea that, oh, good research is rigorous and knowledge that comes from research must be rigorous. Well, my Black life was rigorous, right? Like my life was rigorous, like, right? So when I'm sitting up here telling you, as somebody who has lived this queer Black life and has given a decade in service to queer Black people, helping them while simultaneously trying to figure it out for myself, when I sit down at the table and I say, this is what people need, this is what people are experiencing, I'm not telling you what I feel happened to me. I'm telling you what's happening, and that needs to be as valued as other forms of knowledge when addressing a problem that is actively affecting the lives of real people.
Piggybacking on what you were just mentioning about deferring to the people with these actual lived experiences, Durryle, you had mentioned in a previous conversation that some states won't actually honor a name change or gender change on your ID as a trans person, which can be a form of voter suppression. And our first conversation of the season in January, we actually had a whole panel about voter suppression and all the things that happen to Black folks. Is this anywhere in that equality bill? Does anyone know?
Well, I'm not sure of like the specifics of the bill. I would hope that it would sort of create, it would mandate, or rather provide guidance to states to create processes and practices to allow trans folks to easily change their gender markers on their essential identification. And so, and because our states are operated by people who, some of which don't really give a fuck about sort of Black trans folks and sort of what they need or what they want, it's unlikely unless a federal mandate comes through that if it's left up to the states, you will still see a disparity between who gets access to this particular ability to easily and quickly change their names. Maryland, it's pretty, like, they've been working on it for a couple of years now, so you can it's more easily accessible. It's not quite perfect yet, but it's more easily available. But essentially, if you can't do that, like, you can't vote, right? And then you go, God knows, you go to the polling places, and then people try to do all the misgendering and some maliciously, and so I think all of those, anything that keeps us from the polls is about voter suppression, and I think this would definitely constitute a part of that, and should be a part of the dialogue.
So I wanted to turn the conversation a little bit back to a story of another person that we lost, the story of Layleen Polanco, who was an Afro-Latinx trans woman who actually died in custody in Rikers Island, and how cash bail was the reason why her not being able to meet cash bail was the reason she was actually in Rikers Island. Such a senseless death and a sad loss. There's also all this data from various studies that LGBTQIA plus individuals are incarcerated at 3 times that of the general US population. 35% of Black transgender people have been incarcerated simply due to perceived anti-trans bias. And Black trans women were sexually assaulted in jail at a rate of 38% compared to 12% of white trans women prisoners. Like, how do we even begin to attack the violent structures, the violent structural drivers, and at the intersection of racism and the anti-queerness when it comes to like the prison industrial complex? Yeah, no, yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, It's interesting. Yeah, even it's hard for me to even begin to articulate addressing anything that is related to prison industrial complex as an abolition. I don't believe as an abolitionist. I don't believe in prison and jail. So you know, my opinion is implied in that. I think that, you know, to try to come up with these ideas such as like, oh, police sensitivity trainings about trans folks, they're useless in a system where police are racist and sexist and uphold white supremacy. You know, yeah, it's difficult for me to address this without blatantly calling for the end of it. And I know I don't sit alone in that, but I gladly will if need be. But from a prevention perspective, I guess in alignment with like my academic interests, I would look at possibly opportunities again for community to create like innovative, community-led, driven, developed social interventions designed to help create counter narratives and counter spaces, nationally and globally, to center more Black queer voices in a way that can help us create knowledge and create spaces that can actively challenge us more critically and thinking about seeding the future with more resources than we currently have.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think when you begin to look at the space, we know, or at least some of us know and believe that, you know, we don't buy into the myth that prison is about, or sending people to it is about reform. It is about punishment, it is punitive, and we put people into systems that do more harm than good, and then ask questions about like, oh, I can't believe when they got out, our recidivism rate, they were going right back in, because the violence that was actually occurring in the prison was doing damage, creating trauma, mass traumas at some point, the neglect also, which is a whole nother, I think, component of quote unquote policing, which allows people to just do and act on how they ever will to your body, and to your mind and your spirit. And then to say, go out into this world with lack of social supports, going back into communities that were under-resourced in the first place, without giving you any sort of mental health and sort of financial sort of stability. It's a joke. It's a farce. And so I think when and so, you know, I'm someone who will say like, okay, so what's the bridge between sort of us getting to an abolition and sort of like how we get to start walking on that bridge to do that. And I see people doing incredible work on that right now. Cash bail and sort of eliminating those as a primary strategy at the state level to sort of get some sort of immediate tangible things that sort of create real life openings for people to be well. I am also deeply like inspired by the ingenuity of folks and community-based organizations to do these mass social funding initiatives, and also deeply troubled that in that way we're still participating in capitalism, because essentially we shouldn't be having to raise money to get people out of something when that we know that system is deeply flawed. And so you know, if nothing else, cash bail has to go. That should be like immediate thing across the state. And I know some states are trying different avenues or different degrees of this. And I think COVID-19 has also created a moment of like, it is, for some places anyway, it is better to not have you to be in spaces in mass in close proximity. And so have already created some different ways to then sort of incarcerating people at this time. So yeah, so I think that for me, it has to go. And we need to be thinking deeply about restorative approaches and holding people accountable. And I just can't trust a system that just does harm to you and then expect you to be okay on your own. I think it's horrible.
Yeah. And if I can just add on to that, I think as you were talking, Durryle, it made me think of the opportunity, particularly around the realm of health and healthcare. You know, there's a lot of emphasis that solely focuses on healthcare engagement, right? As being like this sole thing that we look at, like, are you meeting your doctor? Are you having regular interactions with your doctor? But of course, we know that so much more there's so much more constituted of under health. And I think Durryle was speaking to a lot of those things, you know, like if you're under resourced, you're not healthy. If you're homeless, how is my mental health supposed to be good? How is my physical health supposed to be good? We know that, you know, opportunities for economic advancement, for educational literacy, for, you know, housing, for having supportive networks, these all help constitute the healthy body and the sustained body. And so, you know, there really is a need to expand our definition of what healthcare is, what it looks like, what it does, and what it addresses. The goal is to help our community reach sustainability, right? Because as Durryle was saying, it's the lack of these things that contribute, in addition to racism and white supremacy and everything else that's embedded within that structure, but it's the lack of these things that are also critical to health and sustainability that help facilitate this quicker recidivism of folks going in and out of jail. And so, yeah, in addition to just ending prisons and jails altogether, we also need to be looking at expanding our definitions of health.
Well said. Absolutely well said. Now, with these issues that we've been talking about today, related to the community that we're discussing, it seems as if there's more folks that are celebrities, not just queer, but, you know, we have Laverne Cox, we have Caitlyn Jenner. Some say, you know, one of them is not the best example of anything, but we'll leave that alone. But it's unprecedented, right? That we've had these folks that have these actual access to these actual platforms, these big platforms on television and film. But how has that visibility impacted social attitudes towards transness and advocacy for these issues that we've been talking about here today?
You know, I think that visibility is a lot to unpack. On the one hand, we raise awareness, right? And on the other hand, we sort of open a whole other can of worms behind visibility. Like, it's important to note that, like, visibility does not equal safety. Visibility doesn't equal acceptance. It doesn't equal equity, for damn sure. Visibility is just that. It's visibility. Visibility without intention, without action, is useless to a population that is likely to have their life expectancy cut short by over half due to being visible. So I also think it depends on how we're measuring impact in this capacity. You know, awareness has been raised since transness sort of took its place in the spotlight, so to speak, but it's not enough. We need to be moving beyond sort of allowing ourselves to be content with just being aware. You know, it's been a little over 2 months into the new year, and despite almost being a decade of being in the mainstream, we've already had 8 murders and possibly more, right, of Black trans people that have been reported. So there's still trans people who are excluded from full participation in society, who fear for their lives and their safety, who can't find gainful employment, who are harassed by police walking down the street. So I feel like, especially for a lot of people who consider themselves our allies and accomplices, with empathy and with compassion, I say, you know, that it almost feels like, for a lot of them, or some, or, you know, I don't know, the buck sort of stops at this mainstream spotlight. It stops at Pose and America's Next Top Model, because they think, oh, well, y'all made it. And I think that it has to do with this fascination and fantasization of, you know, the trans experience and the trans body. Here for the oohs and ahs, but never really here to get uncomfortable and dirty as often required by liberative movements. So to see us reflected in the mainstream, it's great. It is definitely needed. And I think of myself as a younger trans girl who grew up and did not even see myself reflected in TV. I had to see my first trans woman after I was emancipated and out on the streets. And that's when I met my first, trans woman. So I think of the babies of the future. I think of, the girls who have yet to be born, to know that they will grow up in a world that they can see themselves reflected and have access to a cultural wealth that has seen them reflected, but we definitely need to do more.
Hmm. Understood. So while we're still with you, Vanessa, I know that you are actually on the board of advisors for GLITS, which is Gay and Lesbians Living in a Transgender Society. It's an organization based here in New York. And I know that also one of the challenges that the LGBTQIA plus community has been dealing with is pronounced home insecurity. So according to statistics, LGBTQIA plus youth have a 120% greater chance of being home insecure than cisgender heterosexual youth. And also, we know that GLITS in November just opened the 12-unit apartment building in Queens, which is expressly for members of the community experiencing home insecurity. The building is actually the first of its kind because it's being run by the community that it actually serves. Are there other instances or examples of these types of initiatives, not just in New York, but anywhere in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to say, yeah, you said it beautifully. I was gonna say, like, yes, absolutely. Like, this Glitz One South building is the first of its kind in Queens to be led by Black trans leadership and Black trans people, serving the communities. But we also have examples. So, I want to uplift the work of Fiora Thomas, over at Sisters PGH, is in Pennsylvania. She serves the community and the system in achieving sustainability and independence. She has a house and houses folks and actively supports them in moving from the streets and coming from out of jails and working through substance use challenges and help support them into their own. And though I haven't had the opportunity to meet her, I've definitely been following the journey of Kayla Gore over in Tennessee, who is currently leading innovative efforts to build tiny home communities for Black and Brown trans women. So what I think is important to highlight here is that in 2021, we as a people have had to say, you know what, move, I'll do it. And I'm going to be dead waiting on you to figure out my life is worth saving and has value. And that this is merely just an extension of the work that has already been done by Black trans people, stretching way back to the HIV and AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s. Only this time we're not sliding back furniture and creating pallets on the floor in our tiny spaces. We have these exciting opportunities to see what this looks like expanded out. Community has always organized itself to meet the needs that it has in the face of resource deserts and discrimination. And I think it also just highlights the incredible experience and wealth of knowledge that we have to do this work at this capacity.
Yeah, and I would, lift up our very own in Baltimore, Aya Damons. She's the founder and executive director of Safe Haven, which is a Black trans woman run organization. She created, she houses folks. So she does mobile outreach. She has transitional housing. If you're following her and particularly Safe Haven online on Facebook, you can reach out, because what was very clear in her work, Vanessa, she said, if I have to wait on you all to come to rescue us, we'd be dead in these streets. And so literally saying, no, I want this building and y'all need to give it to me so that I can house the people in my community that you all have discarded. And so it is a great honor and privilege. And you all might have, the photo from the back in, I believe, the summer, it was Safe Haven and under Aya Damon's leadership that organized the trans protest that made the Time magazine. It was captured by Devin Allen from Baltimore. And so that image is of the amazing work that she's doing as a leader, as a Black trans woman saying enough is enough. We'll take it, give us the money, and we'll create the programs that our community says it needs, not the ones that society and these other structures want to provide.
Okay, cool. All right, so with that, go into our last question for the panel. It's pretty simple. Well, I don't know. Nothing's ever that simple. Do you have any advice or instructions on how allies can join the fight for Black trans lives? And that will go to both of you.
Show the fuck up. Show up.
Oh.
Show the and be real with it. Like, show up. Like, you know, what I've learned about sort of allyship is that, like, if you are not risking anything, it's probably not allyship, because it's going to require you to cough up something. Your time, your energy, your material resources, your energy, your life force, to make sure these systems right. Exactly, to make these systems right. So that's you like Vanessa, like you said, so much of this is performative, and so if you really want to, you listening to people, you are sort of asking us sort of what is required for us to be whole, and then helping us to create that vision, and not the other way around.
Yeah. Oh, that was beautifully said. I would just add, like, ally is a verb. It's an action, right? You know, like you can't just show up to the rallies. We still out here dying, right? We need you to be willing to make yourselves uncomfortable, you know, and you know, there might be some feelings on why would I want to make myself uncomfortable? Just know that Black queer folks live in perpetual discomfort in this country, and your silence is very loud. So what advice, what instructions do I have? I think that you need to be definitely using your power and your privilege to open up lanes to bring us in. If they won't let us through the front door, I need you to be going around the side and opening up doors and letting people in on the side. I need you to not just bring us to the table, because that's important too, but the table itself is a problem, right? I need you to provide us with opportunities where you center us in leadership, but also when you ask for our opinions, defer to our expertise, defer to that lived experience, that rich knowledge that lives within something I have lived, but you have only read about or theorized in school, right? And then lastly, as we have discussed earlier, Black trans people are tired of waiting. They have already and for generations been organizing themselves to meet their needs with success. We need you, if you don't feel comfortable putting your body on the line for us, then we need you to put your wallet on the line for us and let us show you what community developed projects look like, and what sustainability for us looks like.
I feel you. With that, we will go into audience questions. We have one question, and that is from Desiree. Desiree says, people tend to think that all LGBT folks are all kumbaya under the rainbow, but they don't like to talk about how Black LGBT folks are marginalized in broader gay culture, but folks want our bodies and our lingo and our style. How can we get beyond the racism in the gay community, or the LGBT community, I guess, and fortify our own communities without being fetishized and consumed?
Ciao. That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. And I think, in how I would answer that is, it's definitely important to stop seeing individual identity in silos, but start taking intentional effort to look at the way that everything is intersected. Just because you are LGBT, as highlighted by the question, doesn't mean that, you can't benefit from privilege and power of white supremacy as a white LGBT person. right? And how you can perpetuate that within your own oppressed group and form these hierarchies. So again, it's going back to this, what do we call on our allies to do? That includes our cis, white, gay, and lesbian, and non-trans allies, or people who say that they are for us. They really need to be grappling with this in their own lives and unpacking and unlearning, and supporting us in building equity, like equity. Yeah. What you got, Bill?
Yeah, so I think my experience living in San Francisco and thinking that I was going to move there and sort of be a part of this gay community, my dreams were crushed, honey, when I got to the Castro, and there was clearly delineated spaces for Black folks, Black queer folks, and sort of white ones. And so I think sort of to stop idealizing our spaces as safe havens when there is no critical analysis of what's going on there in that space. And so our allies don't really, if I would say, in the absence of a critical race analysis, you would see the same dynamics show up with LGBT folks that you would see with cis white folks, and so who might be straight identified. And so at the end of the day, just because you have one identity of marginalization, like we've been trained that that's what we need to focus on and that's all we see and that's how we usually respond. And instead of looking at the ways in which we've actually have privileged identities and how to show up and show out of that. And so I have consistently seen and myself have failed by sort of like, I need to recognize that I am both a gay man that is a target, but I am also a man that has male privilege. And particularly depending on what I'm dressing like the other day, somebody was hitting on me. I was like, these clothes are too neutral, honey, because this is, y'all folks is hitting on me, women, and I'm not, that's not me. So let me put on something a little more clear. But what that really means is that if I only responded out of my place of marginalization, I am never aware of the ways in which my male privilege has systematically erased the experiences of trans folks, women, cis women, and gender fluid or femme folks. And that has created a toxic dynamic within our community. So I think we need to do a better job of not only understanding intersectionality, but in a critical analysis, analyze power through a race, a gender, a class, and a sexual orientation, and the list goes on. And in the absence of that, we just keep reproducing systems of hierarchy, as Vanessa said, in our relationships and in our communities.
Wow. Y'all just took it to church. I'm so grateful for every bit of knowledge y'all just dropped on us today. Thank you so much for your attendance. Everyone out there, thank you so much, Vanessa Warri and Durryle Brooks, for everything that you've taught us today. Where can folks follow you if they want to keep abreast of what you're doing?
Yeah, so I think the easiest place is on Instagram, honestly. It is just Dr. _ Durryle, Durryle. And if you just spell my name, Durryle, you'll only find me because my mother was real creative. That is my own, that I'm the only person in this world that my mom spells Durryle like that. So,
you know, that's what we do. That's what we do.
Yeah.
And for me, similarly too, I think the easiest is just to link with me through Instagram. You can find me at Miss Warri, MS Warri. And again, there's only one because I have a unique last name and I love it. So find me there and connect with me.
Well, we're all glad that there's only one of each of you. Thank you again. Edwin just dropped something in the chat and said, thank you so much for this. Y'all are so brilliant. Heart emoji. Take care, everybody. Please be safe and stay informed. Have a good night. Peace.
Good night.